Certain key moments and experiences in the Frierdiker Rebbe's life coincide with the parasha of Pinchas, which is fascinating because there is so much about the Frierdiker Rebbe that is similar to what Pinchas is all about, the unique level of dedication to Hashem to the point of absolute sacrifice, as we'll discover. The Yemei HaGeula, Yud Beis Yigimel Tammuz, when Yod Tafresh Pei Zayin, the original year of Yud Beis Yigimel Tammuz, 1927, when the Rebbe, the Shver, is befrei geworden b'mai sorrow, when the Frierdiker Rebbe was released from Soviet prison. Sein Neus gefallen b'yom Shlishi Urevi from Parashas Pinchas were on the Tuesday and Wednesday of the parasha of Pinchas. So that's obviously a significant date in the Frierdiker Rebbe's life. Here's another one. Likewise, the Frierdiker Rebbe's birthday, Yud Beis Tammuz Tafresh Mem, right? Also 12th of Tammuz, Tafresh Mem, sagt der Rebbe, as in dem Zman, was man lehnt in der Torah, the Parasha Pinchas, bin ich geboren. There the Frierdiker Rebbe writes that he was born during the time where you lein Parashas Pinchas. And Unruba de Ruba von dem Moros was passiert mit mir Unarumir, and then the Frierdiker Rebbe goes on to make this incredible observation that many of the key elements of what had happened in his life and around him, Zayin Merumas Behelim of Agila in Parashas Pinchas, are alluded to in either a more open or a more hidden way in Parashas Pinchas. So Parashas Pinchas clearly has a link to the Frierdiker Rebbe's life and to Yud Beis Gimel Tammuz. Das heißt, in other words, as Geulosei und Avidosei v'Inyonei Bechlal, the Frierdiker Rebbe's release from prison, as well as his general avoida and even more general elements of his life, haben an engem Verbund mit Inyon Pinchas, have a very clear and strong connection to Parashas Pinchas. And of course, it's not just the parasha, but it's the persona of Pinchas, what Pinchas represents, what happened in Pinchas' life, all of which, of course, is represented in the parasha that is named after him. Interesting that the Frierdiker Rebbe's second name is Yitzchak, which has the same gematria as Pinchas. If you add a yud to Pinchas, a little bit later, we'll come back to that, the significance of that gematria. Like the Zohar tells us. The fact that you have two names that share the same numerical value is that indicates that there's a very deep, meaningful connection and even common denominator between the two names and obviously what they and who they represent. And it's not a gematria that somebody came up with because they were doodling on the back of a paper. This is a gematria that is recorded in Torah, in the Zohar, so it's obviously very significant. So another indication that there's a strong bond between the Frierdiker Rebbe and Pinchas. The truth is that even the Frierdiker Rebbe's first name Yosef has a link to Pinchas, albeit not as obvious as the link to the name Yitzchak. But Pinchas is Mizari de Yosef, because we're told that Pinchas was a descendant of Yosef. The pasuk is Madgish. The pasuk tells us Elazar ben Aaron lokach lo mi benois Putiel, that Elazar ben Aaron, obviously who's Pinchas' father, he took a daughter of Putiel, or a girl who descended from Putiel, as his wife. Says Rashi, who is Putiel? Mizari Yosef shepitbet beyitzroi. That means that this is somebody who's a descendant of Yosef who completely nullified and was made light of his Yetzer Hara. That's who Elazar ben Aaron took as a wife, Pinchas, and their son is Pinchas. So there's a link between both names of the Frierdiker Rebbe, Yosef and Yitzchak, and Pinchas, besides the fact, of course, as we've illustrated, that the Frierdiker Rebbe's life coincides with the story of Pinchas numerous times. Now the fact is, let's just be specific here for a moment. Yitzchak, the second name of the Frierdiker Rebbe, has a much closer relationship to Pinchas, because Pinchas b'gematria Yitzchak, it's the same numerical value, it's easy to see the link. But the Ershon name Yosef is Ashaychas Behelem, whereas the link to the name Yosef is a little bit more obscure, because you've got to know the history of Putiel being Yosef, and from that you derive that Pinchas has a link to Yosef. So we're going to have to conclude, as the Shaychas from Balagula mit Pinchas is in the Avoida was the Shaykh zu Namen Yitzchak, that will primarily see the link between the Frierdiker Rebbe and Pinchas in whatever is illustrated by the name Yitzchak. Whereas the link of the name Yosef to Pinchas and what Pinchas represents won't be as obvious, as we'll explain. So let's first see the most obvious link between the Frierdiker Rebbe's life and Pinchas and what he represents. The Shaychas bepashas of Igilif and the Avodah from Baal Agulam and Pinchasan, the obvious connection between Pinchas and the Frierdiker Rebbe's life and Avodah is in them. Was the Nekuda from Maaseh Pinchas is the Maaseh Kanos. What is Pinchas all about? He is the icon in Judaism of zealousness, being absolutely passionate to an extreme for what Hashem is all about. But kanoyes kinos, as the pasuk says, that the Eibishter attests to the fact that Pinchas stood up, so to speak, to defend Hashem in a zealous way. Was ist mitzad und dem Eiser hakanois von Pinchas, and this zealous behavior of Pinchas, was mitzad halacha von Abel Aramis kanoin poigun boy, is based on an interesting tradition halacha that says that if a person fraternizes with a non-Jewish woman in a public space, those who are zealous for Hashem take the law into their own hands. Is nikar halacha b'din Shulchan Aruch? That's not a law that is recorded in any legal book, not even in the Shulchan Aruch. As mizmuz zaitan. Nobody tells us this is what you're supposed to do if you witness such an event. Because actually the halacha is that should somebody who feels zealous for Hashem consult with an halachic authority and say, am I entitled to kill this person because of what they're doing, we will not get involved. We won't instruct them and direct them in terms of what they should do. Sorry, skipped a paragraph. Not only do we not instruct somebody that this is what you should do, go kill the person. Now, there are many halachic views or rishonim who say that the fact is the Torah doesn't even give a green light to say, okay, you're the zealous person, go ahead and take the law into your own hands and kill this person. No, all the Torah does is it allows the possibility that if somebody should behave this way, they are entitled to be so zealous on Hashem's behalf. So that is a direct link to the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Frierdiker Rebbe was zealous for Hashem in the face of a tremendous assault on Judaism. The Frierdiker Rebbe's willingness to sacrifice, to strengthen and maintain Judaism and Torah in that unholy place, Soviet Russia, which was the direct cause of him being arrested, is does given as even for Mesiras Nefesh, the kind of Mesiras Nefesh that he exhibited, was is in der Uf nit given kein Chiyuv al Pi Din, was the kind of Mesiras Nefesh that nowhere in the Shulchan Aruch does it say is required. Ein moirenke. Nobody can instruct you. This is what you should do. The Shulchan Aruch can say there are certain cases yaharig ve'al yavor that a person has to sacrifice themselves rather than murder, idolatry, or adultery, God forbid. But here, there's no halacha that says you have to sacrifice yourself to preserve Jewish networks of education and mikvahs, etc., etc. And in the Frierdiker Rebbe's behavior falls into a similar category of Pinchas's behavior. Something that if you choose to do it, nobody's going to stop you, nobody's going to criticize you. But it's, well, we'll see later, maybe people will criticize you. But it's certainly not something that is instructed. Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah tells us clearly that if it's not those three cardinal sins, but there's a requirement to have Mesiras Nefesh not to transgress an ordinary transgression, or to uphold a positive mitzvah, is nikan chivat tzivoi. The Shulchan Aruch is clear. There is no instruction to do so, nor harashus biyadai. You have the choice. If you choose to, then the Torah will endorse your choice. So there's the link. The Frierdiker Rebbe and Pinchas have similar dedication to the point of sacrifice for the Judaism where it isn't mandated. Now, McKen Fregan, the only question is, this whole business of Pinchas having such dedication is actually not in Parashas Pinchas. The moment of Pinchas's Mesiras Nefesh is still in Parashas Balak. McKen Fregan, this link between the Frierdiker Rebbe and Pinchas really belongs to the end of Parashas Balak. That tells us about the unique style of how Pinchas served Hashem, and the tremendous zealousness that he showed, the zealotry that he showed. In fact, usually, Yud Beis Tammuz is actually in the week of Parshas Balak, not Pinchas. So we need to understand, well, what is the link between Pinchas in his avodah as described in Parashas Pinchas to the Frierdiker Rebbe, because that's what the Frierdiker Rebbe was highlighting by saying that so many events of his life, including his release from prison, are linked to Parashas Pinchas, not just to Pinchas the person and his story. So to get there, so we have to look at what the Yerushalmi says, as Ma'aseh Pinchas is given, not only is it that Pinchas behaved in a way that is not mandated by Shulchan Aruch and was left up to his own discretion, but actually the other sages at the time did not endorse his behavior. And not only that, but they wanted to take retribution against him. When I was bikshul nadoisai, they wanted to excommunicate him. Were it not for the fact that there was a divine intervention, where Hashem essentially says, but I'm making an eternal covenant with Pinchas for him and for his children all afterwards, which kind of endorses him in the face of the sages who don't want to endorse him. Was for them is verstandig. From that we can understand an even greater perspective and appreciation of what Pinchas did. The extent of his zealotry. Because before that moment that there's this revelation of divine endorsement that says actually Pinchas was right and therefore him and his children will all be kohanim. Pinchas was acutely aware of the fact that his behavior does not have the backing of the chachamim. Which means that the view of the majority, the vast majority of Torah's sages, which is obviously Torah's view, is that this behavior is not the way to behave. So that gives us a whole different perspective on the degree of sacrifice of Pinchas. He wasn't only putting his life on the line, because yes, Zimri could have defended himself and killed Pinchas in self-defense, but it turns out that Pinchas wasn't only willing to risk his life, he risked his neshama, going against the chachamim. Because he's choosing to behave in a way that is not backed by the Torah community, as Bikshul and Nadoisa, to the extent that they wanted to excommunicate him. Look how much Mesiras Nefesh he has. He's not only willing to sacrifice life, he's willing to sacrifice spiritual life too. And that didn't bother him. Pinchas sees what's going on over here. The Jewish people are in a bad place. Shittim, which implies, as the Gemara tells us, that a person would never sin unless they were totally corrupted by some foolish thinking, which is obviously what had happened to the Jewish people. Shtus, the word for thinking related to shittim, the place where they were, as we know really well from Basi Legani. So and Pinchas sees the effects of this, the fact that they behave in this foolish way brings consequences. There's an epidemic now raging through the camp. How relevant is his body, or even his soul, that he's now willing to sacrifice? If he has the capacity to still Hashem's anger against the Jewish people. So obviously he's going to sacrifice everything because he cares about Jews. That is the degree of Pinchas in his zealotry and his commitment and his Mesiras Nefesh, and that's what we see in the Previous Rebbe too. The Previous Rebbe not only did things that were not required, it did things that others frowned on. The only way that a person can have such immense Mesiras Nefesh, where they are willing to risk everything materially and spiritually, must mean that it's the essence of the neshama talking. Because the essence of a Jewish soul, versus B'shosha Hecher from Torah, originates at a level, a dimension, which is even beyond where the Torah originates. And which therefore produces the type of Mesiras Nefesh that is totally beyond even what the Torah can expect of us. Something we spoke about in the previous Sikha from last week. And the Rebbe is the schar of them given, and that's why the response from the Eibishter is also something which is outside of the realm of what the Torah could expect. That they're changed. Pinchas and his descendants are changed from ordinary folk into kohanim. Was das is hecher von der Medida von Torah. That's outside of the bounds of Torah. Torah says you cannot convert to become a kohen, you cannot upgrade to become a kohen, but because Pinchas behaves in a way which is completely beyond even Torah's expectation of sacrifice, therefore the response is even beyond Torah's delineation of who could be a kohen. The way that the Torah defines it, the only way that you could become a kohen is you have to be a biological kohen, that you inherit the position from your father. Aber bald as Pinchas allein is noch nicht gewen kein Kohen. Pinchas wasn't a Kohen himself. So there's no way he could transmit it biologically to his children. But because he showed zealotry on Hashem's behalf, which means his zealotry was completely dedicated to the Eibishter, Vidas is hecher von der Medida von Torah, not dedicated to the rules of Torah, dedicated to the Eibishter who made the Torah. In other words, he's aiming at a level that is even beyond the Torah itself. The Eibishter completely breaks the rules, so to speak, of Torah to induct him and his children forever into Kohenhood. Even though the Eibishter's Torah says this cannot happen, the Eibishter Baal Torah says it can. So now it's Parashas Pinchas that actually speaks the language of the greatness of what Pinchas did. That's where the Eibishter says that he and his descendants will always be Kohanim. Why? Because he was zealous on Hashem's behalf and thereby atoned for the Jewish people. From Pinchas. That is the moment that exposes the unique type of dedication and zealousness that Pinchas had, where he is willing to show Mesiras Nefesh not only in the physical sense but even in the spiritual sense. That regardless of the fact that in the world as we understand it, the voice of Torah is opposed to the behavior of Pinchas, to the extent that they want to excommunicate him, he understands, you're right. Torah, as Torah is against us. But the Eibishter, the Ratzon Ha'ilyan, the supernal will of Hashem, is in favor of this, was his from Torah, and that's beyond what Torah is. We're going to see the exact same kind of experience and behavior in the Frierdiker Rebbe. First and foremost, obviously, the Frierdiker Rebbe was willing to literally risk his physical life in order to keep Torah strong in Russia. But beyond that, because it was the Frierdiker Rebbe was even willing to sacrifice himself for things that the Torah does not expect us to sacrifice for. As we already mentioned before, nobody's going to instruct you that this is a case where you have to be Moiseh Nefesh. But it's even beyond that too. The Frierdiker Rebbe behaved in a way that many of the leading Torah authorities at that time, not half-baked, real Torah authorities, they didn't understand the mode of behavior he chose, and they didn't endorse his behavior. And practically, they behaved differently, most of them trying to get out of Russia so they wouldn't have the challenges. Very similar to Pinchas, where the Chachamim wanted to excommunicate him. This is a tremendous degree of Mesiras Nefesh at every step, at every turn, and as we'll speak about later in the Sikha, it also involves other people that they should be pulled into an environment of Mesiras Nefesh for something that the Shulchan Aruch does not require. Especially when you consider how did the Frierdiker Rebbe operate. Not only was the Frierdiker Rebbe willing to sacrifice himself, but he actually put his entire effort into jeopardy. Like we explained in the Sikha from last week's parasha, as the Ikek was dem hat man im arrestiert, is gewinnt zu sein abgeben sich mit dem Chelek von Tinekischer Beis Rabban. The main reason that they arrested the Frierdiker Rebbe was because of his efforts to instill proper Jewish education in children. That says, in other words, that means, number one, the Frierdiker Rebbe was willing to sacrifice his physical life. We see that he's also willing to sacrifice his spiritual life. Everything he cared about, everything he worked for, everything he was risking his life for, he now risked. Because by jeopardizing potentially all of his other avoida, das ist gewend der Fall, was Jesus der Matze in den Ahi hat angerührt dem Etzem Kim von Innen und Idischkeit. The reason the Frierdiker Rebbe behaved this way and did things which logic would have said, why are you doing that? It's so unstrategic, it's counterintuitive. You're going to put your whole operation in jeopardy because you insist on Chinuch Altaras HaKodesh for children. Why? Why was the Frierdiker Rebbe worked up with such zealotry to that extent? Because he understood that this was an existential threat to the whole of Judaism. That the light of Judaism shouldn't chas v'sholem be extinguished, and therefore the Frierdiker Rebbe wasn't concerned with any limits, any considerations, any rationale when it came to the Mesiras Nefesh, not even what it said in Shulchan Aruch. Completely, absolutely dedicated to preserve Judaism. And therefore, in the Friedrich Rebbe's case, very much like in the Pinchas case, after the Friedrich Rebbe was released, everybody could now realize that what the Friedrich Rebbe did was endorsed by Hashem and was this great atonement, so to speak, this great salvation of the entire Jewish people. As people could now in retrospect identify he was correct, just like we in retrospect identify that Pinchas was correct when it was completely unpopular at the time and even considered to be contrary to Judaism. It became clear that that was the correct type of avodah in such a tremendously extreme circumstance. And of course, the fact that the Friedrich Rebbe is released from prison is an indication that the world, in its own context, endorses the Friedrich Rebbe's behavior. And the only thing is, there is some slight distinction between the story of Pinchas and the story of the Friedrich Rebbe, because the Chelek is aber, was die von Kanoim Poigim by Meister Pinchas, when Pinchas did what he did, and we say, oh, that is the correct in Kanoim Poigim by the person who's really zealous for God should be the one to take the law into their own hands, is Giblin halacha ve'morin loy. Till today, that still remains the type of halacha that we don't actually advise people to follow. They have to work it out for themselves, and then we say, Rishus, you have the option. But the Friedrich Rebbe's behavior, the total Mesiras Nefesh, risking absolutely everything to preserve Judaism, is the Etzem Geula given a klora hira milmaila as das die richtige avodah morinkein. The fact that the Eibishter orchestrated the miraculous release of the Friedrich Rebbe is the highest endorsement that this is the correct way, and morinkein, this is how we should be educating people to behave in the Jewish reality of today. And we see this practically. The Friedrich Rebbe comes out of prison. What does he do? He gets his Hasidim to have the level of Mesiras Nefesh, willing to risk everything materially and spiritually to continue the work. And they, in turn, would influence others to do the same. As we mentioned earlier, that's what's unique about the Friedrich Rebbe's Mesiras Nefesh, is that he draws others into that Mesiras Nefesh too. And this is the only type of avodah behind the Iron Curtain that kept Judaism alive, that kept the coal burning in a way that it was for that generation and for their descendants, and an eternal covenant, as the Pasuk says about Pinchas. So the Friedrich Rebbe's behavior is so aligned with Pinchas's behavior, and it turns out even more so because he passed it on to others, which obviously means there's a tremendous endorsement from on high. Now, with that in mind, let's go back to the fact that we said Pinchas and the Friedrich Rebbe's names are linked as well. We said that the name Yitzchak is going to be the one that has the more obvious link, and the name Yosef a less obvious link. And in a moment we'll see why. It's because the avodah of Yitzchak is an avodah that is much more aligned with this kind of absolute Mesiras Nefesh than the avodah of Yosef. So now let's revisit the link between Pinchas and Yitzchak. Yitzchak, as we already mentioned, the Zohar tells us Pinchas with a Yud is the same gematria as Yitzchak. And the Zohar points out that the Yud only enters Pinchas' name after his Mesiras Nefesh. So that makes it an even clearer link to the fact that Yitzchak and Pinchas must have this theme of absolute Mesiras Nefesh. Weil der Eifen von Mesiras Nefesh hat verbunden mit und nimmt sich von Akedas Yitzchak b'shleimusai. So the reason is because the kind of Mesiras Nefesh that Pinchas exhibits is the kind of Mesiras Nefesh that Yitzchak exhibits, and therefore what empowers Pinchas is Yitzchak in his most wholesome dedication to Hashem, which is illustrated in the story of the Akedah. So when you analyze the Akedah, you see it is also a case not only of willingness to sacrifice the physical, but the spiritual as well. Yitzchak's Mesiras Nefesh is given not no Mesiras Aguf Kipshutai. Yitzchak didn't simply climb up on the Mizbeach and stretch out and say, go ahead. No, it was a much deeper, more profound kind of Mesiras Nefesh happening over there, Baruchness in a spiritual sense. Why is that? Warum? First of all, there's a huge risk to do something that goes directly against a promise from Hashem, which was that Yitzchak would continue the lineage of Avraham Avinu. So how does Yitzchak now risk that by saying, okay, fine, you can kill me? He should protest and say, but the Eibishter said, I am the one who's going to continue. And das the Akedah, ist das der Akedach von ihnen, durch welches sie ist gesollt in ganzen Necke, wenn Avram. Besides the fact that it flies in the face of Hashem's assurances to Avram Avinu that Yitzchak is going to continue the tradition, let's think about continuing the tradition itself. By sacrificing Yitzchak, everything, as the Rambam says it, that Avram Avinu had planted and nurtured and grown is about to die. The avodah von Avram Yitzchak benoitzim afasen sein Shmei Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu ba'olam, the avodah of both Avram Avinu and subsequently Yitzchak, which was to publicize Hashem as broadly as possible in the world, and the Hemshech von Am Yisrael Bichlal, which of course would translate into an ongoing nation called Israel, is all now in jeopardy. Because if Yitzchak is shechted, that's it. It's the end of the whole spiritual dynasty. Not only was Yitzchak willing to go ahead and do all of this, which is mind-blowing, because it destroys all of the ruchnistic investment of himself and of his father. He didn't challenge it in any way. He went with absolute wholeness, dedication, unquestioning. So that's the link between Yitzchak and Pinchas, because Pinchas and Yitzchak do the same kind of thing. They risk everything, including the ruchnius, in order to be able to do what the Eibishter wants, without question. But as we did mention, there is a distinction between how Pinchas behaved and how the Previous Rebbe behaved, and that will be alluded to in the other name of the Previous Rebbe. So the first clue that we get is Yitzchak is very much the same energy and the same theme and the same kind of Mesiras Nefesh as Pinchas, and that links the Previous Rebbe to Pinchas and to Yitzchak. But the Previous Rebbe also has the name Yosef, and that gives us another perspective as well. What's that perspective? In order to understand it, we're going to look at a very interesting principle that's taught in Kabbalah and Chassidus about the gematria values of the name Yosef and Yitzchak, and how it links into the difference between the concept of Gimel, which is the number 3, and Dalet, which is the number 4, because as we'll see, that one is 3 times a particular gematria, one is 4 times a particular gematria, and that's going to give us a deeper understanding to what Yosef represents and what Yitzchak represents, and how the Previous Rebbe Dafka has both. Wenn man das verstehen ab hier am Wohlen Kabbalah und Chassidus, wegen der Chelek zwischen Yosef und Yitzchak, so Kabbalah and Chassidus, the Alter Rebbe brings us, distinguish between Yosef and Yitzchak, and they say, was Yosef is begematria Gimel Pe'amim Shem Ban. We know that the different manifestations of the name Yud Kei Vav Kei, depending on how you spell out the letters, will give us a different total of the gematria value of Yud Kei Vav Kei. So one of those is 52, it's what we call a Shem Ban. So Yosef is 3 times 52, and Yitzchak is Dalet Pamim Shem Ban, 4 times 52. So they clearly are related to the same energy of Hashem, but in 2 different ways. In order to understand what those 2 different ways are, we have to understand the difference between a Gimel, which represents the 3 times, and a Dalet, which represents the 4 times. That will help us understand the difference between Yosef and Yitzchak, and the uniqueness of the Previous Rebbe. In Pashta Oisius, wird man dem Chelek verstehen von dem, was die Gemara sagt, when it gets to Gimel Dalet. So the Gemara Shabbos tells us what's the link between Gimel Dalet, Gemoil Dalim, right? Gimel Dalet, Gimel stands for Gemoil, Dalet is Dalim. In other words, the one who gives or shares to or with those who are destitute. As the Gimel is Meramas if Gimel Chsadim, and the Dalet if Dal. So the Gimel represents the giver, the donor, and the Dalet represents, as you can hear in the word Dal, the person who's impoverished. What's the link? What's the connection? What's the big mystical secret behind this? The explanation goes as follows. The the big difference between giving tzedakah, which is in the hands of the donor, represented by the gimel, the goimel, and receiving the donation, which is dalet, that's the poor person who is represented by the letter dalet, is was the von goimel is a very interesting, subtle concept, that the one giving the money, so the process of being willing and ready to give is only step 1 and the introduction to the mitzvah. The mitzvah hasn't happened yet. Why? Only when the money or the donation reaches the impoverished person, the daled, then that's when the mitzvah has happened. That's when the action is concluded. That's when you have brought life to the person who was so destitute. So what's relevant for us is that Gimel represents the preparation for a particular process, particularly a process of moving and sharing from one to the other. Dalet represents the manifestation or the actual practical side of the process happening. So we can compare this now to any process of flow and giving from one to the other. As Gimel is Meramez of Achana in the Hashpah. Gimel represents the preparation for this flow and connection and sharing to happen. And Vidas is noch beim Mashpia, right? That's where it's still in the world of the donor, of the teacher, of the influencer. Und Daled auf dem Gemara Hashpah, Kabbalah Hashpah durch den Kabel, and 4 represents where it's already hit the recipient, it's already been manifested. And not only is this relevant in the interaction between two people, but it also happens internally within a person as well. When a person is at the Gimel stage, that means they're still getting their head around it, they're preparing themselves to be ready to do a particular activity, action, or mitzvah. Which means primarily the person is living at that stage in the world of intellect and emotions. How do I feel about this? Am I ready for it? Do I understand it? Why is it important? And the maskana und Oisfer von der Keiches von Meise Befehl is nimmers in dem Inyan Hadalet, when the person actually does what they had intended to, what they were gearing themselves or psyching themselves up to do, that will be translated into the Dalet. The Dalet is when it's actually happened. Okay, Al Pizeh is echt moment die Scheiches zwischen dem Isparim Gimel und Dalet, was kommen bis Miches eine noch des Zweiter. And that's why this is not just a matter of the letters of the Aleph Beis that Gimel precedes Dalet, but the number sequence as well. The number 3 is a number that represents being in the state of preparation. The number 4 is the state of application. How is that so? Because we could pretty much say that every process and every flow and every transmission is in 3 channels. Like you might say, Torah Avodah Gemilas Chasodim, or Chesed Gevurah Tiferes, or Chochmah Bin Adas. We'll see in a moment the example that the Rebbe is going to use. On the Gemara Amshach of Yeskum Tarop and Meise Befeil, when those 3 channels have actually now translated into a real practical service, connection, relationship, pu'ula, then you've hit the number 4. Is differte Bechina Dalet, was kommt noch der Amshach von der Gimel. Then you now have a 4th reality, a 4th dimension, which is the result of the input of the 3 that preceded it. So here's an example. We see this in the spiritual realms. So you have 3 worlds that are completely spiritual. They're all about flow and energy and potential and so-called preparation for the ultimate, which is the lower worlds that Hashem wanted. So the 4th reality, where all of this culminates in the so-called action that Hashem intended, that is the world of Asiyah, that is the so-called 4th dimension. Und der Rebbe is Gimel Merin said Asfira Seif Bechinas Yesoid Mashpia. So therefore the letter Gimel, the number 3, generally speaking represents the Sfira, the Midah of Yesoid, which is the Mashpia, the one who's preparing to be able to give. Was is Kolen sich de alle Gimel Kavin. Yesoid is like the culmination of the 3 channels, the Chochmah, Chesed, Netzach channel, and then you have the Da'as, Tiferes. Well, you probably first have the Bina, Gevura, Hoid channel, and you have the Da'as, Tiferes, and then you have the Yesoid channel. So it's the culmination of all these channels coming into a single point, which can then be transmitted. So basically, in human terms, so you've gone through the thought process, you've worked through the various feelings and emotions associated with the thought process, so now you're ready to transmit, you're ready to actually connect with somebody, or with an idea, or with a concept, or whatever it is. And Dalet of Sfir Samalchus, the Regel Horeviv from the Merkava, and Dalet represents the 4th dimension, or as we sometimes call it, the 4th leg of the divine throne, versus Mashpir Befeil and Oilamos, which actually allows this great potential flow to translate into something actual, something real, something tangible that can be communicated in the human context, or can be translated into creation in the divine context. So that difference between the mashpia, who's preparing the process, and the makabel, who's doing the process, that is alluded to also in Yosef and Yitzchak. Vashtelin zusammen ein Shem, which together make a single name, the Previous Rebbe's name. On Dafke Besed is a Yosef and Denach Yitzchak, and specifically where the Yosef comes first. Because you need the Yosef to get to the Yitzchak, you need the mashpia to get to the practical application. Yosef is Bechinas Yesoid Kayodua. We well know that Yosef represents the element of Yesoid. Therefore, Yosef represents the preparation, the packaging, the mindset that will eventually translate into action, into an activity. On Yitzchak is Ramazif the Kabbalah Hashpa Dalet Dalim, whereas Yitzchak represents the being on the receiving end. Now you've got all the Hashpa, you're translating it, you're applying it. That's the letter Dalet. Of Adam Atzmai is das dinim from Maisa Befeil Canal, which, as we said in human experiences, translating your ideals into action. So if you had to generalize or summarize human avoida, you could say this. In the whole concept of being prepared to do something is the world of nishma. It needs to resonate with me. I need to understand it. I need to connect with the principle. Then I'm ready to do it. On the avodah b'foil dalet is dinim for naseh, whereas dalet, which is action actually represents doing it, which may even be, it doesn't yet resonate, and I don't yet understand it, and I'm still doing it anyway. Okay, so we said that there's a difference between the Mesiras Nefesh, which is tremendous, of Pinchas, which is so similar to the Mesiras Nefesh of the Frierdiker Rebbe, and yet the Frierdiker Rebbe is different for a key reason. The Frierdiker Rebbe is a Nasi Hador, Pinchas isn't. So therefore you'll see that the Frierdiker Rebbe has both components in his avodah, Pinchas doesn't. So the two names, Pinchas and the Frierdiker Rebbe's names on the other hand, indicate that there is the subtle difference between both of them having absolute dedication to Hashem, but with a nuanced difference. Pinchas nicht gewend in Nasi Hadar. Right? Pinchas is not the Rebbe of the generation. It's not his responsibility to inspire and instruct people that they should go with absolute sacrifice. Pinchas is the shliach, he's the representative who's actually doing the work of Mesiras Nefesh. He's not inspiring Mesiras Nefesh, he's living with Mesiras Nefesh. The reality of a shliach is it's all about doing what you are required and expected to do. That's what's got to guide you, that's got to be your most important focus and component. So therefore, Pinchas is B'Gamachi Yitzchak, B'chinas Dalet, Dalet Pam Yishem Ban. That's why, what link does Pinchas have to the Frierdiker Rebbe? We said through Yitzchak, the same Gemacha as Yitzchak, which is 4 times Shem Ban, the number 4 representing the Maisa B'Foil, the Na'aseh, when all of the preparation has been handed over and is now being actually applied. The Iyam for Nishma, Nita Zoyfil, the Achonot Zenasidim for Nishma, but the prep, the getting the head right, all of that which is represented by Nishma, the understanding, the resonance, that's not Pinchas's world. In fact, when you're a shliach, too much thinking, too much understanding, too much waiting to resonate can derail the process actually. Because we say that what translates into the ultimate action was the original motivating thought process. Motivating thought process means that it's before the rest of the process, even the intellectual process happens. The Gemara v'Sefer Asiyah langt in Tchila was is koidem hamachshava. Ich faden onahib von der machshava. So the final product actually links into a level and a reality which is beyond where the thoughts, conscious thoughts, began. Therefore, atem mitzaymes is nefesh shalom mailem agbolas hatera uvgiton dem inen von kinei leidei kov und bekanoi es kinosi. Therefore, because Pinchas is now tuned into what? Maiseh, the action, soif maiseh, the ultimate action, that was the intention of the entire process. That gives him access to machshava tchila, something that is even beyond the rational, and beyond that which I understand and resonate with, the Eibishter's personal, so to speak, zealotry. Das heißt, hat langt bis b'chinas tchile, was ist hecher von dem, was ist eingestellt mitzad machshava tchile, mitzad b'chinas hatera. Pinchas is able to connect with and live with a level that is beyond the whole intellectual process, including the intellect of Torah. So Torah says, Pinchas, you may not do this, it's really not appropriate, we think we should put you in cherem, and he supersedes all of that and says, guess what? It's kinei leilei kov, it's exactly what the Eibishter wanted. Pinchas hat gehad die Hachone von Nishma. Pinchas didn't have to go through the Nishma process, it was done for him. Was hat Makabel given for Nasi Adar? Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu, he's the Nasi Adar, went through the Nishma process, understanding and processing and appreciating what behavior is required at this time. How do we know that? Pinchas says, as Rashi tells us, he says to Moshe Rabbeinu, I received the tradition from you that Aboyel Aram is kanoim poigim boy, that this is what has to happen. He didn't make it up himself. The achana was made by Moshe Rabbeinu. The framing of the principle of this kind of zealotry was taught by Moshe Rabbeinu. Aber der Inyan von Nishma ist dennoch bei ihm gewähnt behelem. But in Pinchas' story, all of that is behind the scenes. Begolav ad Goshe is going to Eisfin the Shlichus. What we see when we watch Pinchas' story is somebody applying the principle. That's what we see. The person who reads the letter has to execute its contents. In other words, he is applying the theory in practice. That's because Pinchas is a Shliach. But when you're talking about the Nasi Hador, that the Friedrich Rebbe was a Nasi, as we saw in last week's parasha, the Nasi encompasses everything about the entire experience of Judaism and Torah. And Nasi cannot only have one side of the coin, the Nasi has every element in its most complete form. The Nasi has perfect application in action and perfect appreciation and understanding and resonance. Was der Rebbe is das Mudgesh is sein Namen Yosef Yitzchak. That's why you can see it reflected in the Friedrich Rebbe's name. Both of them. Both Yosef and Yitzchak, Yosef, the Friedrich Rebbe has absolute mastery of all the intellectual, emotional preparation that has to happen for a particular mission, represented by Yosef. On Saidi Kabbalah Sashpor, the Nasi Yitzchak, and the application of all of that preparation into real practice to the extent of total Mesiras Nefesh, represented by Yitzchak. And you're going to see both of these reflected in the Friedrich Rebbe's Avodah. The fact that the Friedrich Rebbe was able to motivate all kinds of Jewish people, from the greatest to the smallest, to complete Mesiras Nefesh. That's why the Friedrich Rebbe had such a multifaceted shlichus of building mikvois and setting up chadorim and sending the right people, rabbonim here, sheichtim there, moyalim there, etc. So you see the action. The action is that Friedrich Rebbe actions Judaism under threat in the most successful, effective way across the spectrum. And simultaneously, the Friedrich Rebbe is this master educator in every sphere of Torah, from the revealed to the esoteric to the most esoteric, Nishma, which is all about the intellectual and emotional process. Because the Friedrich Rebbe is a Nasi Hador, and Nasi Hador incorporates all of the elements that are necessary and that are important to make this happen. Das geht euch at Tesvasbora in the Sheikhs von dem Baal Agula Shma Yosef Yitzchak zu Pinchas. And that is going to give us an even deeper appreciation of the Friedrich Rebbe, his names, and the link to Pinchas, and most importantly for us, a practical lesson that we could apply in our lives. Bei seiner Shluchim hat der Rebbe gemont unmont euch jetzt. The Friedrich Rebbe had an expectation, and he demanded of his Shluchim then and now, as the Gemara says, you grab every opportunity to do Torah and mitzvahs, like the person who's at the banquet, and you grab whatever food and drink you can get. Which means hecher far cheshbon, beyond any long-term strategies and rational approaches. Das heißt, in other words, the Friedrich Rebbe's primary objective is you've got to be on the same page as Yitzchak, you've got to be on the same page as Pinchas, you've got to be ready to do whatever it takes at whatever cost to keep Yiddishkeit growing. We have to step out into the world to have a positive influence on other Jewish people to engage with Torah mitzvahs. Even those people who are not yet so-called fully prepared. Es fällt ihm noch in dem Nishma von den Jonathan Mitzvahs, dass darf auftauen auf zweiten Jeden. The person has, I'm not yet holding there. I haven't yet processed, I haven't yet understood, I haven't yet resonated with those things that you now want me to share with something else, with someone else. Says the Friedrich Rebbe, darf aber bei ihm schön sein, der Nase, der Bittel und ein Werkleg für zweiten Jeden. You just got to go, you got to do. You've got to do with complete dedication and surrender for somebody else, to help somebody else. Look at Pinchas' example. That he risked everything to help the other Yidden, that they should escape the horrible epidemic that was raging through the camp. And at the same time, while somebody is reaching out and touching and inspiring another Jewish person to engage with their Judaism, when the primary focus is action, because that's what counts. And we'll see a practical halachic example that the Alter Rebbe brings in Tanya. The Alter Rebbe tells us in Tanya, clear halacha, that having intention or thought processes does not equate with actions or even with speech. If a person went mentally through the Shema in their head, with the most powerful, focused intention, they've achieved nothing in terms of the obligation, the mitzvah, and they have to read Shema again. Whereas if the person said the words without any intention, they would have actually discharged their obligation. So that's what the Previous Rebbe wants to empower us to do. I might not be ready for it. Go out. The main thing is engage people in their Judaism and make sure that they engage in a practical way. Especially now that we're at the end of the period of Galus, in the end of Galus. We don't have the luxury of time to wait until we've worked everything out inside of ourselves and then we'll reach out to somebody else. Because Mashiach is imminent. We have to use every free moment with complete Mesiras Nefesh to do and to get others to do. Especially when you consider I'm not doing this on my own bat, I'm doing this as a representative of the Nasi Hadar. Then I have packaged inside my avodah all of the understanding, the insight, the resonance, which the Nasi Hadar, the Meshaleach, already packaged. He already did all the back work. Like Pinchas already had Moshe Rabbeinu behind him. Right? I'm getting my strength from you. And here's the amazing part, that when I actually activate another Jewish person to actively engage with their Judaism, packaged inside that is an element of understanding and resonance that I didn't even give them, because I'm going with the koyach of the Meshaleach. In fact, that itself is alluded to in the name Yitzchak, which is the name that represents action with Mesiras Nefesh, which we said has the gematria value of 4 times Shem Ban. 4, we said, speaks about the Makabel, the actual application. But still, was dalet meint gleichzeitig der Misma von 4. It's not just the 4th, but the number 4, alle 4, Nit no deferta, which includes all the number sequence that comes before it, not only the 4th step of the sequence. In other words, when I get to 4, it means I already have 1 and 2 and 3. In other words, by the time I get to the point of Ma'aser B'Foel and getting others to engage with Ma'aser B'Foel, I'm now packed in with all of the value and the insight and the wealth and the understanding of the 3 stages that precede, the Gimel that precedes. So when we have this absolute dedication, without wasting time, without overthinking it, just to go out there and reach out and get other Jewish people engaged in Judaism in practical terms, that is the avodah that earns us Pinchas, who manifests as Eliyahu Hanavi, the one who will herald Mashiach. And then Eliyahu Hanavi's job will also be nasa, which is bringing it back to Judaism. It will be the 4th in a sequence of Geulas, and therefore alluded to in the number 4. As we know, there are 4 expressions of Geula that speak about the future time of Mashiach, which is also linked to the 4 cups of misfortune that the Eibishter will share with those anti-Semitic nations, and corresponding to which the Eibishter will give us, the Jewish people, 4 cups of consolation, and all of that should happen because of Mamash more immediately than we could even imagine.